Thank you, Harold, so much. And Harold and I do go back to the beginning of recorded time here in Washington. I was sworn in as a congressman on the same day Tip O'Neill was sworn in on the first day as Speaker of the House in the United States Congress. And over these 40 years that I have been in Congress, one of my absolutely highest goals has been to protect the firefighters of our country. 2 years ago, after John Kerry and Ted Kennedy left, they had served 76 years in the Senate. Irishmen, there is no known instance of an Irishman in Massachusetts voluntarily leaving Congress. Okay? It's like a civil service job. So between Elizabeth Warren and I, we now have about 4 years of seniority in the United States Senate. And we try to fight just as hard and just as effectively, which is difficult because it is Ted Kennedy, it was John Kerry, but to fight for the causes that the firefighters stand for. And so it's been my great honor to be a friend of Harold over all of these years, and I thank you, Harold, for your friendship, for your leadership on these issues. But we thank all of you who are here. Eddie Kelly is down here from Boston with the entire incredible Massachusetts team, and it's my honor to work with them every single day up in Boston. We consider ourselves as a Massachusetts delegation that is tied to the firefighters, that works hard in order to advance the agenda of the firefighters. And although I'm going to talk to you about one particular issue, I just want to say that it is my honor to work to support you for the creation of a firefighter cancer registry. Absolutely indispensable. I've had friends and an uncle who passed away from that kind of exposure. That we have to ensure that we protect public sector pensions, that we have to ensure that we do the job to ensure that that which people work for are in fact protected, that we have to continue to work towards a Cadillac tax repeal. We've pushed it back now, and we have to continue to work to protect the health care which people are entitled to, and that we ensure that there's full funding for SAFER and for FIRE Act grants, and that the Marketplace Fairness Act is put on the books. It makes absolutely no sense that if you buy something online that you're not going to be paying the local sales tax that if you had walked into the store on Main Street, because then there is an avoidance of the taxes that have to be paid in order to ensure that the firefighters, the policemen, the teachers get paid in that local community what they are entitled to. And we must pass that Marketplace Fairness Act. So I'm here today to talk about toxics. And I'm not talking about Donald Trump's rally speeches. I'm talking about the Toxic Substances Control Act, which is also probably a good name for Ted Cruz's super PAC these days. This year, Congress has the opportunity to pass a chemical safety reform bill to overhaul the nation's broken TSCA Act of 1976. The nearly 40-year-old Toxic Substances Control Act is the last of the major environmental laws of the 1960s and 1970s that has never been rewritten, notwithstanding how much we've learned over all of these years about the impact that toxic substances can have upon the health of people who are exposed to it. And I'll be the first to admit that it's been hard to get things done lately in Congress. The last Congress was the least productive in the history of our country. Today, we can't even get hearings on a Supreme Court nominee to replace Justice Scalia. We can't even agree on emergency funding to help the families of Flint, Michigan, who were exposed to the lead in the water which they were drinking. But amidst this rancor, there are bright spots. Last month, the Senate passed bipartisan comprehensive legislation to combat the opioid crisis, a battle that you are waging on the front lines every day in your communities back home. And the Senate just passed pipeline safety reauthorization legislation, which included my amendments to improve the safety of natural gas distribution lines and protecting our first responders. Now, I understand that many of you may get about as much joy watching the workings of Congress on C-SPAN these days as doing your taxes. But I do believe that we can get some vital things done in Washington this year. There is one area in which there is a glimmer of bipartisan hopefulness, and that is the high probability that Congress will enact a comprehensive reform of the Toxic Substances Control Act in the next few weeks in the United States Congress. As the senior Democrat on the Senate Subcommittee of Jurisdiction, I am one of a handful of members in the House and Senate who are participating in an informal conference with the House. And my staff is amongst the few people who are in every single meeting as the chambers work to reconcile the two bills into a final product. And why is this so important, especially in this era of dysfunction? Well, what we need to do is to just identify the reality that TSCA is a statute that simply does not work to protect anyone, because ever since the industry, the chemical industry, successfully challenged EPA's proposed asbestos ban, EPA has not been able to effectively use the authority Congress intended it to have. When the Senate bill was first introduced, I actively opposed it. And when it was debated in the Environment and Public Works Committee, I called for significant changes to be made and was one of the 5 members to vote against it because the bill still was not good enough to protect firefighters, to protect ordinary citizens in our country. But after months of constructive but difficult negotiations with Senators Udall and Vitter and Inhofe, Senator Durbin and I became the 59th and 60th senators to support the bill, and it is in no small part because of our changes that the Environmental Protection Agency sent a letter to Congress describing its preference for the Senate bill across almost all of the TSCA reform priorities. So let us be real here. When the EPA, the entire chemical industry now, Jim Inhofe and Ed Markey all agree that they prefer the Senate's rewrite of a major environmental law. It's kind of like Halley's Comet. You want to make sure you see it because it's probably not going to happen again in our lifetime. Is the bill perfect? No, of course not. No true compromise ever is. But I thought it would be useful to describe some of my priorities, which I believe are all very consistent with yours. A good case study into why TSCA reform is needed can be made using the chemical TBB, which I imagine is familiar to many of you. TBB is a flame retardant. Studies have shown that flame retardants don't do much to prevent fires, but they are known to cause cancer in the firefighters who are exposed to them when serving in the call of duty. TBB replaced a different flame retardant called PBDE, which was a known cancer risk that some states and the EPA finally regulated. EPA allowed TBB to be manufactured starting in 2004 without first having to affirmatively determine if it was safe, just like current TSCA laws allow EPA to do for the more than 700 new chemicals that come into commerce every year. The Senate bill reforms EPA's new chemicals program to require EPA to do more before a new chemical can be manufactured. The House bill does not. We now know that TBB may be as dangerous as PBDE was, but the only reason why we know the chemical composition of TBB at all is because a university researcher bought a product that contained it and chemically analyzed it. That's because current TSCA allows too much information to be kept secret by the industry so that individual citizens and firefighters do not know the danger of the chemical that they are being exposed to. Our bill increases transparency about dangerous chemicals and requires confidential information to be shared with medical and first responders, but the House of Representatives version of this bill actually increases the secrecy, keeping that information from the public. Once EPA realized that it really should never have allowed TBB onto the market as a new chemical in the first place, it decided to add the chemical to its TSCA work plan of chemicals that are of particular concern. And EPA says that it doesn't yet have enough information to regulate it under the existing chemicals authority in the law that's on the books today. The Senate bill removes existing TSCA obstacles to getting new test data on dangerous chemicals. The Senate bill also includes provisions that I negotiated which require faster regulation of the chemicals on the TSCA work plan and real deadlines for industry to have to comply with new federal regulations. The House bill does not contain any of these provisions. One area that has been very prominent point of debate on TSCA reform is preemption. I remain committed to further improving upon the Senate preemption provisions to ensure that states can continue to be the toughest cops on the beat. I am sure that you know all too well that the reason the flame retardant PBDE was taken off the market was because of California and Washington and Maine all took action first before the EPA did. If an individual state wants to move on one of these chemicals, if your great Massachusetts team has the capacity to be able to get a law passed up in Massachusetts, then we can't have a preemption that then stops that movement across the country because there's a law that's been put on the books that has a lower standard nationally than would have otherwise have been on the books in California or Massachusetts and other states that ultimately would have become the precedent for other states. But under the House bill, anytime EPA takes any action at all on a new chemical like TBB, even an action as minimal as telling workers to wear gloves when they make it, states would be preempted from taking any action at all to regulate that chemical forever. The Senate bill doesn't contain any preemption of new chemicals at all, and what's more, it more clearly ensures that older chemical safety laws in states like Massachusetts and California are forever exempted from being preempted so that there can be a laboratory of democracy that is examining these issues, creating the precedents, the analysis that then can be used nationally. That is critical in terms of its necessity of being included in legislation. We also know that sometimes federal regulators don't do enough to protect people, and sometimes companies lie about the risks their chemicals cause, which means the federal regulators don't have the information they need to do their jobs. We've seen this play out with PCBs, Teflon, and other toxic chemicals over time, and time again when people discovered that the companies lied about the dangers and harmed people and the environment. With company secrecy and deception, a reality that can't be ignored. No matter how strong a law we write, people will continue to be made sick and even killed by exposure to toxic chemicals. And when that happens, their families deserve to have an avenue where they can be awarded damages to help compensate for their losses and their pain, and the law has to guarantee that if they've been harmed by these chemicals, that they can sue. Remarkably, the House bill contains a provision that would result in the automatic dismissal of lawsuits brought by people harmed by any chemical EPA has ever taken any action on under TSCA. This list includes PBDE, TBB, Teflon, hexavalent chromium, the chemical that was the subject of the movie Evan Brockovich, PCBS, formaldehyde, and lead paint. In other words, what your job entails you to be exposed to on a daily basis. They would make sure that you could not sue if you were exposed to those chemicals. The Senate bill, on the other hand, ensures that victims of toxic chemical exposure can at least have their day in court to argue their cases. The House bill also includes a provision that has gotten very little attention. It exempts replacement parts for products that contain toxic chemicals from TSCA regulations. If the replacement parts were designed before the regulation goes into effect, that means that couch replacement seat cushions could forever be coated with TBB and other flame retardants, even if the chemicals are banned from being used in everything else, and that is just plain wrong. And finally, EPA won't be able to use any of its new authority without money. And without a full resolution and elimination of the problems in existing TSCA that led to the asbestos ban being put in place in the first place. And by the way, a vision without money is an hallucination. If there's no funding in this bill, in order to be able to accomplish these goals, then at the end of the day, the protections will not be put in place. The Senate bill contains language that I negotiated that gives EPA guaranteed industry fees to do its chemical safety work and completely removes the legal arguments used to overturn the asbestos ban. The House bill does not. So, to those of you who get frustrated with Congress, I'm in your club. But we cannot let that stop us from getting big things done. The legislation to reform and update TSCA that unanimously passed the Senate represented the kind of bipartisan commitment married with compromise that yields important, long-lasting policy. We have more work to do in the conference committee to get us across the finish line, but I do believe that we are getting close to producing a good bill. I'd ask you all to do what you can to support a strong and meaningful TSCA bill that will put real reform in place that will truly protect the lives of firefighters and protect the lives of ordinary Americans across our country. There are times when the political climate can seem as toxic here in Washington as the materials we are trying to regulate through this bill. And some might argue that Congress itself should be banned as a toxic material. But if the more moderate voices that still exist in the business and political communities and within groups like the firefighters can gain more traction, then we can help turn this Washington gridlock around. We can quiet the fierce rhetoric and turn it into a more common sense, moderate, civil tone. And we can roll up our sleeves and turn this bill into a law and protect the health and the safety of the American people. We need to do that together, however. We need to recognize the danger of these toxic materials and how much harm they do to firefighters and ordinary people across our country. So I've enjoyed working with Harold and the firefighters throughout my entire career. I've obviously enjoyed working with Eddie Kelly and all of the Massachusetts team that is up there. I have been someone who has tried to have a 100% record with the firefighters for 40 consecutive years in the United States Congress, and this is just one more issue where we have a chance to enjoy a tremendous victory. And I just need your help, though, to lobby wherever you can to push the members of Congress towards the safer, more common sense approach of regulating toxic chemicals within our society. So thank you all for everything that you do for our country. Thank you for everything that you have done for me. Thank you all for having me here today. Thank you, Howard.